Since the beginning, Philadelphia and its surrounding communities have looked after, taken care of, and given back to each other in times of need. All with love. WMMR has lived in the Philadelphia spirit since the Marconi experiment in 1968. We will always put Philly first.
It's now time for the WMMR Public Affairs Show on 93.3 WMMR Philadelphia.
You're listening to 93.3 WMMR. This is Public Affairs. I'm your host, Marcus Goldman. With me today is a professor of history at Rider University. His name is Joseph Wojie, and he is here to talk about the seedy side of Philadelphia. An interesting, different look at Philadelphia. I know during Prohibition, New York and Chicago are the cities that they talk about in Hollywood and in the TV shows. But a lot happened in Philadelphia, and Philadelphia, for as important as it is in the birth of America and shaping of America, there's always that seedy underbelly that goes with every major city, and Philly had its own seedy side. So we are going to talk about that today. Joseph, thank you very much for coming down from Rider University right before school starts to talk.
Hey, Marcus, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it. So, yeah, just as you said, Chicago and New York, they get a lot of the press, and you're looking at probably 10 times the gangland slayings when you're looking at like Chicago in comparison to Philadelphia, a city like us. We had been talking, I think, before, we were being recorded here, but the sheer sort of corruption, I think, in the city of Philadelphia is one of the things that sort of lended to the fact that you don't get as much press here in Philadelphia either. I mean, we have 1,152 dry bars, probably close to 5,000 speakeasies altogether. And what you're looking at is corruption kind of across the board.
Mm-hmm. That corruption that started, I guess, in 1920, or I guess with Prohibition, was a whole different kind of corruption. Was corruption before the 18th Amendment bad? And did the 18th Amendment Prohibition take corruption to a whole new level because of the fact that this is an overnight drastic change in American society? All of a sudden, no booze.
Well, people didn't really foresee the corruption that it would create. Basically, the Volstead Act was not very popular in a lot of circles. And so for probably $15 every other week, that's at least what the grand jury investigation in 1928 uncovered, you could stay open as a speakeasy by paying the beat cop their take. So since a lot of people didn't really want necessarily to deprive a World War I vet, let's say, of an alcoholic beverage. Some guy that just got home from trench warfare, and we were drinking one minute, we're not drinking the next minute. It's very difficult to enforce it. And the Prohibition agents, by and large, there were less than 3,000 Prohibition agents altogether. We were under the impression that this would be enforced at the local level, which really never happened. Local officials in most cities, almost across the board, were open to taking graft. They were open to taking bribes and leaving these things stay open because it's not looked at the way we look at like crack and heroin and stuff like that today. It's 1 minute you're able to drink, the next minute you cannot drink. So it's not very easily enforced.
It's one of those laws that it seemed like it made no sense. We mentioned Chicago, and Al Capone was big during that time, and he was a big booze runner at that time. And like you said, there were a lot more deaths and shootings and violence in Chicago that was reported, but there was still that stuff happening in Philadelphia. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the culture around that time in Philadelphia and how it was so different from Chicago and New York, two major cities that always get major mention?
Well, they had big organizations. They had large organizations where we had a lot of people were just violating the Volstead Act on a smaller scale. Probably on the biggest scale, you would have had Max Boo Boo Hoff. He controlled he had the Quaker State Industrial Alcohol Complex on Grays Ferry Avenue, where he made industrial-grade liquor that was meant to be used for hair products, paint thinners, things like that. And he just wouldn't denature. Denature is a fancy name for put poison in so you can't drink it. He was probably the biggest player. So he controlled the booze, or Mickey Duffy winds up a little bit later on, controlling the beer distribution in town. So these are our big kind of players. But certainly nothing on the scale of like an Al Capone, although a lot of people don't realize that Max Boo Boo Hoff was one of Capone's major suppliers of industrial-grade alcohol.
Oh, really?
He's the liaison as well. For a lot of people realize that he stayed at Eastern State Penitentiary when he was in Chicago in a war with Bugs Moran. After the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, he doesn't want to have retribution, and he wants to run his gang from basically a fortress. So he runs it from Eastern State Penitentiary. That was Max Huff, who hooked him up with Shuey Malone, one of his many connections on the Philadelphia police force, sent him down to stay at Capone's estate in Miami. After the Atlantic City Conference, which it gets a lot of the HBO Boardwalk Empire kind of, gets pulled into it with this. Yeah. But after the Atlantic City conference, hosted by Nookie Johnson, not Thompson like the show calls him, they met at the Stanley Theater here in Philadelphia. I believe that was like 23rd and Market. I think it's still a theater now. It's a peep show. I don't know who goes
I think
to
it's the porn theater at 23rd and Market now.
Yeah, Pee Wee Herman maybe, over there occasionally. But yeah, they met there, and he said, Mr. Capone, nice to see you again. Let's arrest you for that gun charge that we talked about. And they went to Eastern State Penitentiary, and it was sort of an arranged situation. But that was the liaison for that was Max Boo Boo Huff, though.
Oh wow! But like in Hollywood, though, you saw a lot of because of the lake, there was a lot of the booze coming in through Canada.
Oh,
at that time as well.
That was the high grade stuff.
Yeah,
that was a lot more costly,
like the rums and the vodkas from overseas and the Scotch whiskeys. Okay,
yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so bootleggers would bring that in. I guess in the northern states up where we are, we would get the very high price stuff from Canada, whereas the southern states might get some stuff in from Mexico, and of course the rum runners would use Nassau in the Bahamas was kind of a point of, like a hub for the rum running. They were probably, I should say, the Coast Guard, the most successful in any one organization to stop anything kind of illicit liquor-wise coming in. And Smedley Darlington Butler here in 1924 was, I believe it was 1922 or 24. He was in there for 2 years. He was the director of public safety. He was the most successful here in stopping things basically along the Delaware River. Of course, Mayor Freeland Kendrick had gotten rid of him because he was a little bit too Elliot Ness-like. Then everybody didn't get their cut. That was one of the things that the populace sort of saw, the corruption in the government. They lost faith in the government. And then all of the gangland warfare, because it's a big business. There's dollars here. And that made people like FDR, for example, who had been for Prohibition, change his mind.
He was for Prohibition?
He was for Prohibition initially, like a lot of people. Wow. And they didn't foresee all of the corruption, the crime that was created. And people lost faith in the government.
How could they not lose faith in government? They're taking away your right to have a nice cold drink after a day's of work. You're going to lose faith in government for that.
Well, in 1934, we got our faith back.
Yes, we did. But still, 14 years. Whoosh. Long time now. Also, it seems maybe, is there a lack of romanticism that complements the brutality that went with Philadelphia as far as why it's not mentioned as much or Hollywoodized as much as far as that seedy side and that underground and some of the things that happened?
Well, a lot of the gangsters, they were not necessarily, the Lanzetti brothers aside, I suppose they were in the paper a lot. They were making that grade B Philly shine down in South Philly. But the big players, Max Huff, his own guys would get busted, not even know that they worked for him. So it was kept out of the paper a lot. If you look at Philadelphia, that's how corrupt it was, at least according to the grand jury investigation. That's kind of the conclusion of that, one of the conclusions. And so when you're looking at like Chicago and New York, it wasn't as corrupt. All cities across the board were corrupt, but we were a little bit more so than most. That's what they kind of uncovered. So they were not really in the paper so much. And if you want a little bit more fair look at what was going on during Prohibition, you can look at some of the suburban papers, Westchester County Times or something like that, as opposed to the Philadelphia Inquirer or the Philadelphia Bulletin.
They would cover it?
They would cover some stuff, and they wouldn't cover others. I mean, because Max Huff, he was never arrested. Not until the Prohibition agents came in after the grand jury investigation, uncovered who he was. Then he's on the front page of the Philadelphia Inquirer, king of bootleggers, they, call him. And the Prohibition agents basically followed him around. They couldn't get him for anything else, so what they would try to do, much like what happened to Nookie Johnson in the end and Al Capone in the end, where the IRS got them for tax evasion, what they tried to do is follow around Boo Huff, and they passed off counterfeit money to him. He wasn't a counterfeiter, but they caught him using a $20 bill at 30th Street Station and arrested him for counterfeiting, and he's like, oh my God, what, are you kidding me, really? This is a guy that made 12 cents an hour rolling cigars as a kid, and now he's got $12 million in the Union Bank and Trust Company. You're not going to be able to use the money in jail, so he retired. And he beat the charge, of course. His lawyer's Congressman Golder, so he's a very well-connected fella.
Wow.
But the only day he did in jail in his life was when they arrested him for that. They basically tried to railroad him for counterfeiting and couldn't get him on that.
And he retired from his life after that?
Never.
Took his money and ran?
He totally did. He died of natural causes. He died young now. He was in his 40s. Unfortunately for him. Well, he was something like a Meyer Lansky, where Meyer Lansky would have done time, probably, if he had not died, I think, of like prostate cancer. He was in Forbes magazine as one of the 10 richest guys in America at the time when he did that. So he was older. He was, it was a little later, but both of those guys, had never actually been convicted of anything, and they're kingpins.
Very interesting. Now, do you think he died of natural causes in his 40s, or do you think
Huff?
Hoff?
Yeah,
or do you
I
think
would
there was
think
a
so.
conspiracy there?
No, I don't think.
Do you think he just died of a heart attack or something like that?
I forget what it was that he died
Heart
of.
attack, stroke, something like
I think
that.
he had high blood pressure. He never drank. He never smoked. He threw the best parties that there were. He was like a little kid, though. He'd shoot you with spitballs and rubber bands and stuff like that.
So
But I do believe, that he died of natural causes. I don't think there was any foul play. He retired.
Did he have any kids? Does his bloodline still run in Philadelphia?
I'm not sure. I don't want to make things up.
Yeah. No, I know. I'm just curious, but I know as a history guy, you may even have some access to some of that information.
I'll have to look it up because it's really interesting.
Again, with me is Joseph Wojie. He is a professor of history at Rider University. Do you have any books or any places where you can recommend people go up and maybe read about the seedier side of Philadelphia, some of the crazier things that happened?
Well,
not only
absolutely.
during Prohibition time, but early mob Philadelphia. I mean, you have the labor unions and the corruption with them throughout history. So, and we can even go back, which hopefully we will, to the beginning of Philadelphia and talk about some of the things that happened on the darker side there as well.
Fun topics. Absolutely, yeah. There's great academic sources, and then there's some a little lighter reading too. So for great academic sources, you want to read Mark Haller. He was, before he had passed, at Temple University. He's written a couple of essays, as well as Paul Frazier, who's done a dissertation on the subject of Prohibition in Philadelphia, in particular, University of Albany. For a little bit of lighter reading, Thomas H. Keel's Wicked Philadelphia covers a little bit of stuff, not really Prohibition stuff, but he'll cover a little bit of grave robbery stuff, some things that happened during the American Revolution with the British excesses here in 1777 with their occupation here, some parties that they threw at maybe not the time that they should have been having wild parties.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about some of that revolutionary insanity that happened?
Sure. Well, let me talk about the grave robbery. I think the grave robbery
grave
stuff
robbery is
that's
interesting.
it's a little bit after the time of the Revolution, but we actually had the biggest grave robbery ring in the United States history here in Philadelphia. I think it was 1882. It was in the 1880s, though. Levi and Robert Chew out of Lebanon Cemetery were actually shooting out bodies directly, kind of a cottage industry that it was outside of Philadelphia. We probably had the need for 2,000 bodies a year for just medical students. I mean, if you go to Penn Medical School, for example, today, you're going to cut cadavers open because you need to understand human physiology. It's why the Egyptians understood more than everybody else, but the church didn't really like that too much. It was sacrilegious. So doctors of the period understood that they needed to practice, because if I'm a surgeon and you come to me and I say, hey, I'm at a medical school and I read it in this book, but let me practice on you. Now, if I practice on a dead guy a lot of times, then I will practice makes perfect, so to speak. So they were acquiring these corpses early on. When you're looking at like during the Revolutionary period, they were digging them up themselves a lot of times, the doctors and the medical students. But by the 1800s, when you got this big grave robbery ring here, have passed it on to like those one-eyed hunchback henchmen like Dutch Pillet. I picture Igor when I picture this guy. He was busted with the key to Jefferson Medical School with a one-horse cart, middle of the night, with 8 dead guys on this one-horse cart here. And apparently William H. Forbes, the anatomy demonstrator, was purchasing those bodies. So at a time where a Union soldier's pulling in $13 a month, and maybe a porter loading and unloading a ship, you're looking at, they didn't get paid by the hour, but the equivalent of about 5 cents an hour. Enterprising young man, not afraid to get his hands a little bit dirty, pulling about $8 a fresh body. That's what Forbes was paying for them, according to Dutch Pillet. And Frank McNamee was the ringleader. Louis McGaggery of the press, he broke the story.
Was Dr. Mutter involved in any of that stuff?
No.
Or was he more on the cleaner side as far as that goes?
Yeah, the College of Physicians is a very interesting place to go, though, to check out this kind of thing.
Yeah, the Mutter Museum's phenomenal. It's another interesting side. I didn't know if there was any seediness involved there because, I mean, there's death and bodies and skulls and things like that, and you associate some sort of darkness with that sometimes, so I thought maybe there would be a tie in there. But the grave robbery ring is really fascinating and creepy at the same time.
It really is, and if you look at the fact that grave robbers, I mean, they're not the most intellectual guys on the planet, right? So sometimes when they would dig people up, like not in this case with the Lebanon Cemetery guys, but when you're looking at the smaller cottage industry of grave robbers, they would dig people up and see that they were basically buried alive, because you'd have claw marks inside the coffin. Now, you had tuberculosis, they called it the consumption back then. It would put people in a catatonic state, and they would be mistaken for dead a lot of times. And then so these grave robbers, and it's kind of a thing that worked its way over, I guess, from Eastern Europe and then through Britain and to us, but they were believed to be vampires in a lot of cases. And the people around them would be affected by vampirism, they would say, because basically, if you look at somebody that's got tuberculosis, they're pale, they're thin, they cough up blood, so there's blood in their mouths, right? And then everybody around them, after they die, winds up dying too, because they've spread contagion.
Yes.
And so I think the most crazy case of it, because it was documented pretty well, was up in Exeter, Rhode Island, and it was around the same time as in the 1880s. Mercy Brown, though, her father, George, with all the village, they dug her up. They dug up his wife, Mary. They dug up his eldest daughter, Mary Olive, and then they dug up his daughter, Mary, or Mercy, rather. They would cut the hearts out of the chest to see if there was blood in the heart still. And the source vampire would have to be killed by either bashing the teeth out or cutting the head off, in a combination of cutting the heart out or staking him. So little Edwin, he's the little brother that's got tuberculosis, right? Well, they think he's being affected by vampirism, and they feed him his sister's ashes. They're like, look, we've just dug up your dead sister. We cut her heart out of her chest. We got this concoction. We burn her heart in these ashes, and drink this. He dies 4 months later. Obviously, he's got tuberculosis, the poor kid. But this is the kind of thing that was going around. Even in the Age of Enlightenment, you still have people that are superstitious. They're not necessarily literate. And when it's dark outside, it's just dark.
Yeah.
Things that go bump in the night and all that.
That's crazy. What happened during the Revolutionary time? You mentioned these raging parties that the British had. What did they like, the American booze or something like that? What went on? I
know that it's Thomas Keels has written about it in his book. It's not one of the chapters that really do it out to me, so I can't riff on that necessarily off the top of my head. I do know General William Howe looked at us when he occupied Philadelphia as just, obviously rebels. And if you look at it from a historical perspective, it's the weak that have always been dictated to by those that are strong. The victors write the histories. And so if we would have lost the revolution, obviously we would have been looked at, Washington as the Benedict Arnold of this situation.
Absolutely.
So William Howe thought that we were just, rebels and troublemakers, and he outlawed drinking liquor actually during his occupation, and at the same time housed British soldiers in the Pepper Pot Brewery, it's over by where the Bourse Building is today. But the beer was one of the safer things to actually drink. It didn't get that you didn't get dysentery from drinking beer. They heat the wort up during the process to make it, and so it kills all the alcohol. You'd give beer to your kids to drink. There was no drinking age, bars didn't close or anything like that, until after Prohibition. That's when we start to regulate alcohol. And we didn't even regulate guns or drugs until after Prohibition. At a time where you're looking at, you're not supposed to be able to get a drink, you can go to the pharmacy, and Bayer, the maker of our favorite aspirin, made a cough suppressant with heroin as the active ingredient. Teething formulas with cocaine as the active ingredient. Crazy
morphine stuff.
You could order from Sears and Roebuck. You could get for $1.50, you could get 1 syringe and 2 shots of heroin from Sears and Roebuck through
Amazon.
Through the mail.
You hear that?
And you can mail order a Tommy gun for about, depending on what year.
That's just crazy.
$150 to $175, depending on what year you bought it. $5 for extra cartridges. They were fully automatic too, not like today where you would just have to pull your finger on the trigger, but it just sprayed. Only thing too, because it shot a .45 caliber slug that shot through a Ford. Fords were not like our cars today, I'll tell you, where you could shoot through them with a pellet gun.
Metals.
You could just spray it, and it shot .45 caliber slugs. Not very accurate Tommy gun, but it sprayed at close range. You were done. Mickey Duffy, he had actually gotten shot in front of the Cadix nightclub that he owned, 23rd and Chestnut, 5 times, and lived with a Tommy gun. And they sent him to Hahnemann Hospital. He donated to every nurse that breathed in his direction.
Oh, wow.
Built himself a solid steel office in his house afterwards.
You got to do something like that if you've been shot 5 times.
Yeah.
Holy cow. When we first landed in Philadelphia, I know that a lot of stuff came up through the Delaware River because the boats would have to travel up the river to land in Philadelphia. Was there stuff going on at that time in early Philadelphia that was a little on the underside or underhanded? Any piracy, any weird stuff like that?
Absolutely pirates in Philadelphia. Earlier than that, though, let me go chronological here.
Okay.
So when William Penn arrives in 1682, he sees the Dutch are already here, so they have these caves in the embankments of the Delaware River. You've got like this 30-foot sort of embankment, and people were living in there, but they've got like brothels in there, and they've got tippling houses that would be like a lower establishment of drinking, and they've got gambling, and William Penn filled them all in. I mean, God, like what they would do, human rights activists would be all crazy. They would chuck a dog in a pit with rats, and see how many it could get, within a minute, and people would gamble on this stuff. Yeah, William Penn put a stop to it. I mean, he contemplated making this a dry state, actually. He was a Quaker, didn't want people to drink. He had a couple hundred slaves, but he didn't want you to drink.
Makes sense.
But in any case, so yeah, obviously we're a pretty large city, and so what you're looking at is we're bigger than Boston and New York for a while, even put together. So a lot of the pirates would come here pre-United States, during colonial times, and they would hawk their stuff here. They would fence their goods, basically. So they're not necessarily going to rob anybody here, but they're going to sell their stuff. And so, and then they would go to Boston and New York, as well, and then come back down. But some of the pirates that we had, probably Edward Teach, or AKA Blackbeard, was the most famous pirate that everybody would be familiar with, that came to Philadelphia. William Kidd came to Philadelphia. They stayed right downtown at 2nd and Market. There'd be brothels all up and down 2nd Street, where all the bars were. That was the historic barfront district. And they would treat their men there. And the bars never closed. This is a time where, wow, I mean, Blackbeard, God, he was a ship's captain and he was a pirate, right? So he was just like, I'm going to do what I want, right? I'm Blackbeard. When you're Blackbeard, you can do what you want, right?
That's true.
So he would marry these girls. And they were like 16, 17 years old. He's like, well, you're going to be my wife. I'll take as many wives as I want because I'm Blackbeard and I say so. And you're not going to say yeah? Well, you're going to go overboard? So he had a bunch of wives. And so he also had a girlfriend that lived here in Philadelphia. Margaret Rambo was his. She was also a Swedish widow, just like Margaret Matson was. But she was Blackbeard's girlfriend. Now, she lived, and her house is still there, preserved in Marcus Hook. They call it the Plank House because it's built out of ship planks. There's a Preservation Historic Society there that it sort of runs like little Blackbeard walks every year down there for around Halloween. I guess it's hip to do that. But legend had it that there was a tunnel when Governor Keith finally put a warrant out for his arrest that led straight from the Delaware River all up under her house, and his men would guard that tunnel so he could see her. He liked her so much. He wanted to still hang out and see her and spend some time. And archaeologists looked for the house. I mean, not for the house, for the tunnel that led up under the house. And that's how prevalent the urban legend was that was found to be nonsense. They couldn't find a tunnel, but it was so prevalent that they looked for it, actually.
Who was the witch you just mentioned? Martha?
Margaret Madsen.
Margaret Madsen.
Now, she was the one witch to be put officially on trial during our colonial period. It was the year after William Penn got here, 1683, and he was the judge. And all the peasants were, like, she bewitched my cows. She bewitched my cows. That was the charge, basically. A lot of times when you're looking at witches, when you're looking at people who got accused of witchcraft, whether it's in the old world or the new, it's widows that don't have family. They're elderly. They don't have family to stand up for them and say, like, hey, man, she's not a witch. Knock it off, John, my neighbor, or, whatever, the name is. So she's a widow, and that's, they were prime kind of targets for that. But William Penn, interestingly, the way that the kind of court doc is written, basically said, like, well, he asked her if she flew on a broom, actually, because he says, yeah, hey, they say you're a witch, you fly on a broom, and she can't understand it. She can't speak English. She's Swedish. So she said yes. And because she had to pick yes or no, and basically William Penn saw through it, and he just, he called BS thing, and basically what he said was he found her guilty of the fame of a witch. In other words, she's guilty of people thinking she's a witch. She's not really a witch. I believe he gave her a fine, though, and then she fled to New Jersey because she was scared. She couldn't understand what was going on. She can't speak English, and these English here are causing a lot of trouble for her.
That's pretty crazy. Wow. See, there's all this underbelly that goes with, like, the greatness of Philadelphia and the fact that there's so much rich history as far as the birthplace of America, the Constitution, the Declaration being signed here. You have the Liberty Bell. But then you have all this other stuff, the underbelly of Philadelphia, which goes with the good stuff. It just, they seem to work together for some reason. And to hear about the side that maybe you don't hear about as much because, number one, Hollywood doesn't portray it correctly, or number two, it's overlooked by Hollywood because there isn't the romantic aspect that maybe a Chicago, a Boston, or a New York has. But still, just as much crazy stuff happened here in Philadelphia.
It'll probably be next to be covered. I think it's just that there's more people that live in Boston and New York and Chicago, And those guys are much more famous. I think a lot of our stuff has been really overlooked, though. If you look at a lot of the stuff that goes on, or went on rather, in colonial times, all the way up through now, we're by and large over. I think the only one real thing that has been touched on, Silence of the Lambs. They take a couple of the aspects of Gary Heidnik. We had these serial killers in the 1980s. Yeah. We had the Frankfurt slasher, the corpse collector, Gary Heidnik, who's technically not a serial killer because you have to kill 3 people to be a serial killer. He's only killed 2. Yeah. It was only a 4-month episode there. But 2 of them died. He would argue accidentally. Silence of the Lambs, the Buffalo Bill serial killer. They take a couple of aspects from Gary Heidnik, like that pit. He had a pit in his basement on Marshall Street, North Philly, where he would put them it was a punishment pit. when they misbehaved, he would put them down in solitary confinement. And he had a dog as well. He had a German Shepherd, though. Wasn't that little precious? Sounds of the Lambs. He wasn't making women's suits. I believe that was taken from another serial killer, not in Philadelphia. God, I don't want to lie yet. But yeah, they took a couple of aspects of Gary Heidnik for Sounds of the Lambs, which is interesting. Psychologically, an interesting guy, too. Very, very intelligent, but a lot of problems, too, obviously.
Now, who else did you mention? The Frankfurt slasher?
Frankfurt slasher, it was 80 to 85. So he, under the wire with DNA test, no DNA testing until like 1987, and oh my God, he had mommy issues too. When you look at the kind of, when psychoanalysts look at serial killers, kind of what they find is that, they didn't get enough hugs as kids. And he was probably like that too, a little like Jack the Ripper, where there would be just these loads of blood. Well, at least Jack the Ripper's arguably first case with Martha Tabram, lots and lots of blood there, and then he changed his modus operandi, and there wasn't blood, possibly. Some people argue that, but with the Frankfurt slasher, lots and lots of blood. We think that he was taking pictures, Polaroids, of these victims because they would be posed in provocative sort of terms, like you would see in, say, a Penthouse magazine or something like that. So we think that he was taking photographs and
Did they ever turn up those photographs or not?
No, not that I'm aware of.
I bet he destroyed them.
Not that I'm aware of.
Wow.
He was never caught. Arguably, he was not caught because Carolyn Dowd case, one of the last victims, there is Leonard Christopher is convicted of that. He maintains his innocence. He says he's not guilty, and the other cases are still open, and so it's arguable because the killings stop after that. And so maybe the slasher realized somebody was in custody. Michelle Denner was killed after Carolyn Dowd, though. Stabbed 23 times, same area. So arguably the slasher may have then realized somebody was in custody and decided this is a good time to stop.
That's some pretty crazy stuff, the underbelly side of Philadelphia. Are there any other areas? I know we've talked a little bit about the speakeasies and the brothels. Is there any other area that we've overlooked that kind of shows that seedy underbelly of Philadelphia?
Well, we didn't really talk a lot about brothels yet.
That's true.
So brothels have been around. It's the oldest profession.
Yes, it is.
Obviously. So you had brothels from the very beginning. The hookers gay ladies actually, they would be called back then, because they're happy. Well, they're happy to give you syphilis as long as you pay for it, I suppose. But they would operate at the docks because that's where sailors would come in after being out at sea for 4 months at a time. They'd have a paycheck, so to speak. They'd have money to spend, and they wouldn't have seen women for quite a while. So they would take advantage of that down at the docks. And eventually, you start to have these brothels, these houses of prostitution that would essentially, according to neighborhood, charge. Because if you were in the northern end of the city, now the city's a truncated version of Old City and it's kind of Society Hill as we see it today, back then. And so the further toward, say, Market Street, which was called High Street back then, they would be more high class resorts, you would call them, because you would have a whole experience. There'd be a chef and servers, and the ladies would be usually widows forced into that rather than starve. And they would be paid very well. So these are high-class places, and you would spend the night, obviously, but you were expected to have a woman that was educated and accomplished, according to Victorian times. Accomplished would have, it may take on a different connotation in a brothel, but accomplished was to mean play piano, sing, have intellectual conversation, things like that. But as you get down further toward Cedar Street, which is South Street today, then the brothels become, you get what you pay for. They're a little cheaper. Further out from the colonial period, then the city expands and the brothels expand as well. And so the Callowhill Hill Expressway runs through where the Tenderloin District would have been in the 1800s. John Wanamaker was the one really to tirade against the brothels around the time of World War I and succeeded in getting these shut down, because a lot of times they would have police as, moonlighting as the bouncers. And so, you're at a brothel and, well, there's Philadelphia police officers that are your 1800s. Your bouncers there, you really don't want to cause trouble. It's an extra reason not to cause trouble.
Absolutely.
That's why they would obviously look to try to hire some folks like that. But John Applegate owned one. It was huge. It was only in operation about 2 years. And then the people around the city, they burned it down, actually. But he had a place that they sort of colloquially called it Applegate's Flying Circus, because it looked like a big circus tent inside of this massive building, and it was built on property that was owned by a church initially. So they believed that there were a couple of burials that were just people not reinterned, and they were still like under the property. But he probably had over 100 prostitutes per night, mostly freelance, that were operating out of this place. Now, he had probably a half dozen, or maybe a dozen on the payroll there, but huge place. And then there, just like earlier in Southwark, which would be Queen Village now, you had, it was a place called the China Factory, because it used to be, it wasn't Chinese women in there, but it used to make porcelain. It used to be a porcelain making facility, the premises prior to that. And it was massive. And you're looking at, this is a period of time where, before Prohibition, they never closed the bar. Mm-hmm. It was open 24 hours a day. There was no drinking age. There was no any sort of closing time. And so people would go to church on a Sunday morning, and there'd be drunks out there. And the citizens in the neighborhood, they just, they burned that down as well.
Oh, wow. It's interesting that bars never closed back in the day. And after Prohibition is when all the regulation came in. There's still places you can go, like New York City, where the bars sometimes stay open all the time. And they now have after-hours clubs and things like that skirt around some of those. It makes sense that you have some that are for the higher end, for the big businessmen and the wealthier, and they get the educated, the more Victorian women.
Right.
And whereas you go into, like, an area that's more rundown, say today, like Kensington or Fishtown, you're going to get what you pay for, without a doubt.
Yeah, well, let me see. There was one brothel. It was called the Gerard, actually. And Stephen Gerard is probably turning in his grave, because it was a whorehouse named after him. But they're all hanging out now on Gerard Avenue, aren't they?
Oh, yeah, they are. That's
hilarious. He can't win for losing. I guess his name's attached to that, as much as he did for our city.
Good stuff. Again, with me is Joseph Wojie. He is a professor of history at Rider University, and he is here talking about the seedy side of Philadelphia throughout the time, going all the way back to the colonial time and touching up today on the modern time. And again, we could have kept this conversation going for hours, because there's so much fascinating and interesting stuff to talk about as far as that aspect of Philadelphia. Is there anything we didn't talk about? Are there any websites you recommend people going to? Anything as far as information where we can get people who want to do the research about sin in the city of brotherly love or any of that stuff, they can get information?
Well, I have one absolutely exceptional website. If people want to go to, it would be www.grimphilly.com. There's a tour company called Grim Philly in Philadelphia that does all of this stuff on various different tours, like 9 different tours. Contracts, authors and history professors to do tours for them, and I'm a part of that as well. But it's exceptional, and it's geared to public history, so it's not necessarily done for only academics. It's done, where you have a couple of drinks even too, for like an Oktoberfest tour or something like that, and then you'd learn some stuff about colonial brewing and things like that.
All right, so grimphilly.com, and will they be able to, if anybody has any questions about this, will they be able to reach out to you all at grimphilly.com with questions? Is there a question and answer place there?
Yeah. If you wanted to email, it would be info@grimphilly.com, and Grim is spelled with 1 M. Also, you can give a call to the number. It's 856-829-3100. So again, grimphilly.com, 856-829-3100, and you can get all the information that you want. You can email us, and we'll hit you guys back. We'll get you a reading list or whatever you're looking for, too.
Excellent. Joseph, thank you very much for stopping by today. It was awesome talking to you.
Cool, Mark. It was great being on the show. Thank you for having me on.
You bet. Thanks. You're listening to 93.3 WMMR. This is Public Affairs. I'm your host, Marcus Goldman. If you would like more information about the seedy side of Philadelphia, shoot me an email at publicaffairs@WMMR.com. Also, online there will be a link with the complete interview with Joseph Wojie. We had to cut it short due to time constraints, but boy, he has some great information in the complete interview. Again, thanks for listening. Enjoy your Sunday.
The WMMR Public Affairs Show is locally written, recorded, and produced by your host, Marcus Goldman, with topics that relate to the WMMR listening area to better serve and inform the WMMR family. Thank you for listening.